The thick, heavy air of the sixth dawn carried the metallic smell of dried blood and the pungent odor of despair. Dr. Elias Vance crawled among the wreckage of an overturned taxi, the twisted metal creaking under his weight. His eyes, bloodshot and burning with sleep deprivation, scanned the deserted but not empty street. Shadows danced, and each rustle of wind seemed a whisper, a call. 6 days. 6 days since the world had turned upside down, since the breaches of insomnia had become a shroud. He flinched as a sharp, guttural sound tore through the silence. It wasn't a cry of pain, but a lament of torment, a distorted song of broken minds. The insomniacs. They were everywhere, their slender, erratic silhouettes moving like uncontrolled puppets through the once bustling streets. Their eyes, empty and fixed, searched for something, anything that could ease the agony of perpetual wakefulness. And Elias knew what they sought. They sought sleep. The sleep they couldn't have, and which, therefore, they wouldn't allow anyone else to have. The deadly rule of the apocalypse was simple, brutal, and undeniable. The insomniacs hunted the sleepers. Any sign of rest, of calm, of peace, was a beacon for their frenzied fury. A yawn, a prolonged blink, the slow rhythm of a deep breath. All of this was an invitation to violence. Elias had seen what was happening. People dragged from their beds, from their hiding places, their bodies torn apart not by hunger, but by a primal envy, a need to destroy the tranquility denied to them. He clutched his backpack to his chest, feeling the weight of the sample vials and the encrypted laptop. This was his burden, his penance. He and his team had warned, had shouted from the rooftops about the dangers of Knox-Free, the miracle pill that promised to free humanity from its slumber. But no one listened. Now, the world was paying the price, and he, Elias, felt responsible for every broken mind, for every torn body. His destination was the old underground laboratory, a forgotten bunker beneath the city center, where Lena and Kenji awaited him. If, indeed, they still awaited him. Communication had gone down on the third day. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, but the need to find a cure was a fire burning in his veins, keeping him awake, paradoxically, in a world that could no longer sleep. A figure darted past on the periphery of his vision, an insomniac. Its movements were quick, disjointed, like a giant insect. Elias held his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. He forced himself to remain still, to show no sign of fatigue, of vulnerability. Just a few more blocks, just a few more steps to salvation or to final damnation. The sun was rising, but it brought no light, only the promise of another day of vigil and terror. Not long ago, sleep was seen as a burden, a waste of precious time. In a world obsessed with productivity, with the relentless pursuit of more, the 8 hours a day dedicated to rest seemed an unsustainable luxury. People lived at a frenetic pace, driven by stress, anxiety, and the constant feeling that time was a relentless enemy. Sleepless nights were the norm for students, professionals, and even exhausted parents, all seeking an advantage, an extra moment to achieve their goals. It was against this backdrop of collective exhaustion that Somnus Corp, a pharmaceutical giant with a history of disruptive innovations, launched Knox-Free. The promise was audacious, a pill that would eliminate the need for sleep with no apparent side effects. The advertising was ubiquitous, seductive. Unleash your potential, conquer time, live more, do more, be more. The cost? Ridiculously low, making it accessible to everyone, from Wall Street executives to factory floor workers. The acceptance was meteoric. In a few months, Knox-Free became a global phenomenon. Entire countries saw their productivity rates skyrocket. People boasted about their new lives full of extra working hours, new hobbies, more time with family, or so they thought. The world seemed to have found the key to a utopia of efficiency. The streets never slept. The factories operated 24 hours a day. The stock exchanges never closed. Humanity had freed itself from the shackles of the night. Dr. Elias Vance, then a respected neuroscientist at the University of Geneva, observed the phenomenon with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. He led a small team of researchers dedicated to the study of sleep and its complex mechanisms. For them, NOx-free was an anomaly, an affront to human biology. Sleep is not a luxury, it's a fundamental need, he often said in his lectures, his voice laden with a concern few shared. Removing sleep is like removing gravity. The consequences may not be immediate, but they will be catastrophic. His colleague, Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant geneticist with a penetrating eye for detail, had already begun analyzing the molecular composition of NOx-free. "It's a marvel of chemical engineering, Elias," she admitted, "but the way it interacts with brain receptors is aggressive. It's not natural suppression, it's forced shutdown." Kenji Tanaka, the team's epidemiologist, was already compiling data on pill users, searching for any patterns, any deviation from the norm. But in those early days of euphoria, his warnings were just whispers amidst the chorus of praise. The world was awake, and there seemed to be no turning back. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed as anecdotes or minor side effects. Increasing irritability, occasional memory lapses, a persistent feeling of brain fog that many attributed to overwork or the stress of modern life. After all, who wouldn't be a little more irritable after working 18 hours a day, even without needing sleep? Somnus Corp, with its well-oiled public relations machine, quickly released independent studies that attributed these symptoms to external factors, never to NOx-free. Elias and his team, however, were not fooled. Their own studies, funded by small grants and donations from independent foundations, began to paint a different picture. In laboratory rats that received an analog of NOx-free, they observed microscopic changes in the neurons of the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for decision-making and impulse control. "It's as if the brain is constantly in high alert mode," explained Lena, pointing to the magnetic resonance imaging scans. "There's no time for repair, for memory consolidation. It's a silent exhaustion." Kenji, with his graphs and statistics, began to notice an increase in traffic accidents, medical errors, and domestic violence incidents in regions with high rates of NOx-free use. "It's not an exponential increase yet, Elias," he cautioned, "but the correlation is undeniable. People's patience is dwindling. The ability to process complex information is being compromised." They tried to warn people. Elias published articles in scientific journals, participated in conferences, and gave interviews to smaller media outlets. His voice, however, was drowned out by the clamor of the corporate media and the enthusiastic testimonials of celebrities and business leaders who swore by NOx-free. He was labeled an alarmist, a Luddite who feared progress. Somnus Corp, in turn, launched a subtle smear campaign, questioning the integrity of his research and the validity of his conclusions. The first turning point, the point of no return, came when Lena, working with brain tissue samples from users who had died from causes unrelated to the pill, made a disturbing discovery. "Elias, come see this," she called, her voice strained. Under the microscope, there was something that shouldn't be there, a subtle but consistent genetic alteration in the DNA of the neurons. It wasn't a random mutation. It seemed programmed. "It's as if the pill is rewriting the code," Lena whispered, her eyes wide. "Not just suppressing sleep, but altering the very structure of the brain to adapt to this new reality. And we don't know what the ultimate goal of this rewriting is." The seed of doubt had germinated, and its fruit promised to be bitter. The genetic mutation, initially a laboratory curiosity, began to manifest itself on a large scale. Not explosively, but like a slow and relentless rising tide, engulfing society. Insomnia, once a symptom of modern life, became a chronic condition, even for those who had never touched NOx-free. The social pressure to stay awake, to be productive, had infiltrated the collective psyche, and the human body, in its quest for adaptation, seemed to be surrendering. NOx-free users, the billions who had embraced the golden promise, were the first to feel the true weight of perpetual vigilance. Irritability turned into paranoia. Brain fog gave way to sporadic hallucinations, fleeting glimpses of something that wasn't there, quickly attributed to extreme fatigue. But the fatigue didn't come from work, it came from lack of sleep, from a mind that never switched off. Society began to fragment. Small outbursts of violence became more frequent. Trivial arguments escalated into physical aggression. Empathy diminished, replaced by a cold indifference and widespread impatience. Kenji, with his data, showed alarming graphs of nervous breakdowns, psychotic episodes, and an unprecedented increase in crimes of passion. People are losing the ability to regulate their emotions, Elias, he explained, his voice choked with emotion. It's as if the most primitive part of the brain is taking over. Despite mounting evidence, Somnus Corp maintained its facade of denial. They launched a new campaign, Knox Free: The Awakening of Humanity, which attempted to reinterpret the symptoms as adaptation phases to a new era of expanded consciousness. Governments, many with their own leaders and bureaucrats addicted to the pill, hesitated to act, fearing the economic collapse that a Knox-free ban would bring. The world was addicted, and the addiction was stronger than reason. Elias and his team, now isolated and with scarce resources, continued their research in a makeshift laboratory. Lena had confirmed that the genetic mutation was not just an alteration, but a complex restructuring of the hypothalamus and brainstem, the regions that control the sleep-wake cycle. It's irreversible, Elias, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Even if they stop taking the pill, their brains have been rewritten. They can no longer sleep. The natural mechanism has been deactivated. The news was a devastating blow. The hope of simply stopping the pill and returning to normal was an illusion. The world was trapped in a cycle of forced vigilance, and with each passing day, collective sanity ebbed away, preparing the ground for the true nightmare to come. The first wave had passed, leaving behind an exhausted society on the brink of collapse. The second wave didn't come like a tsunami, but like a dense, suffocating fog that settled over the minds of billions. The inability to sleep, once a condition, became torture. Sporadic hallucinations transformed into vivid and persistent visions, shared by groups of people, as if a single mind were projecting a collective nightmare. The streets, once vibrant with the incessant activity of the awakened, were now the stage for bizarre scenes. People conversed with invisible entities, gestured into the air, laughed or cried for no apparent reason. Reality disintegrated, replaced by a tapestry of overlapping and intertwined delusions. Paranoia reached epidemic levels. Neighbors distrusted neighbors. Families disintegrated under the weight of unfounded accusations and irrational fears. Governments, finally waking up to the gravity of the situation, tried to impose curfews, security zones, and quarantines. But it was too late. The infrastructure began to fail. Power plants shut down, communication systems collapsed, hospitals were abandoned. There was no one left to operate the machines, no one to maintain order. The few who still retained a shred of sanity were overwhelmed, exhausted, and soon joined the mass of the sleepless. Elias, Lena, and Kenji, barricaded in their makeshift laboratory, watched the collapse unfold through intermittent news feeds and desperate radio broadcasts. They're organizing themselves, Kenji murmured, pointing to a digital map that showed the Insomniac's movement patterns. It's not random. There's a kind of collective consciousness emerging from their hallucinations. They're being drawn to certain points as if following an invisible command. Lena, her face pale and eyes sunken, had made an even more terrifying discovery. The mutation not only prevented sleep, but also created new neural connections, a kind of synaptic network shared among the affected individuals. That's why the hallucinations are collective, Elias, she explained, her voice trembling. They're experiencing the same nightmare, the same distorted reality. And that reality is driving them to act. The nature of this shared reality was what terrified them most. The Insomniacs were not merely mad, they were driven by an internal logic, a delusional narrative that propelled them toward a single, terrible mission: to eradicate sleep. They saw those who could still sleep as aberrations, as enemies of their new truth. The deadly rule was solidifying. The insomniacs hunted the sleepers not out of malice, but out of a distorted conviction that they were purifying the world. The second wave had transformed society into an open-air madhouse, a prelude to the hell that would unfold in the following days. The world was on the brink of the abyss, and the fall would be dizzying. The third day of the second wave marked the beginning of the downfall. What were once isolated outbreaks of violence had now transformed into a global carnage. The insomniacs, previously erratic and disorganized, began to move in groups, their shared hallucinations uniting them into a terrifying force. They were not zombies in the traditional sense. They did not seek flesh, but rather the annihilation of any vestige of peace, rest, and sleep. Elias witnessed the first live broadcast of a mass attack. A mob of insomniacs, their eyes glazed and their bodies contorted in spasms, stormed a hospital, not to loot, but to drag patients from their beds, to break life support equipment, to destroy the very idea of recovery and rest. The screams of the victims were drowned out by the guttural wails of the attackers, a macabre symphony of despair. The deadly rule manifested itself in its most brutal form. An exhausted man tried to hide in a closet, closing his eyes for a second. The sound of his deep breathing, the relaxation of his muscles, was enough. The insomniacs found him, their skeletal fingers tearing at the door, their faces distorted in a mixture of fury and envy. They dragged him out, and what followed was a ritual of dismemberment, not with knives, but with their bare hands, a desperate attempt to deconstruct the essence of sleep. The cities had become death traps. The few remaining sleepers hid in makeshift bunkers, in dark basements, anywhere they could avoid the attention of the insomniacs. But the constant vigil was exhausting, and with each passing hour, more and more people succumbed to sleep deprivation, paranoia, and finally, mutation. They joined the ranks of the insomniacs, their eyes emptying, their minds merging into the collective consciousness of the nightmare. Elias, Lena, and Kenji in their underground laboratory felt the ground tremble with the echoes of the violence above. They were the last bastions of reason in a world that had gone mad. Communication with the outside world had ceased completely. The world had fallen. "We need a cure, Elias," Lena said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Not just for sleep, but for the mind, to break this web of delusions." Kenji pointed to a heat map showing the concentration of insomniacs. They're converging towards urban centers, toward places with higher population density. It's as if they're searching for something or someone. Elias knew that time was running out. With each passing minute, the mutation deepened. The web of delusions strengthened. Hope was a tenuous thread, but he clung to it with the strength of a shipwrecked man. They were the only ones who could fight against the shackles of insomnia, the only ones who could try to bring sleep back to the world. The fall had been complete, but the fight for redemption was only beginning. The bunker, a former abandoned biological research laboratory beneath the streets of Geneva, was a sanctuary of concrete and steel against the chaos reigning above. Elias, Lena, and Kenji had managed to get there, exhausted and traumatized, but alive. The security door slammed shut with a heavy hiss, sealing them in an almost deafening silence that contrasted brutally with the screams and laments they had left behind. The air in the bunker was filtered, clean, but heavy with the smell of ozone and disinfectant. Fluorescent lights hummed softly, illuminating rows of scientific equipment, computers, and shelves filled with books and samples. It was a refuge, but also a prison. "We did it," Elias murmured, dropping his backpack to the floor with a thud. His muscles protested, but adrenaline still coursed through his veins. Lena, already seated in front of an electron microscope, barely looked up. "Getting there is just the beginning, Elias. Now comes the hard part." Kenji, for his part, was already connecting his laptop to one of the lab's servers, searching for any remaining data, any information that might have been saved before the global collapse. The first task was to analyze the samples Elias had brought, fragments of Insomnia's brain tissue collected under dangerous conditions. Under the microscope, the mutation was even more complex than they had imagined. It wasn't just an alteration in the hypothalamus, but a large-scale restructuring of the cerebral cortex, creating new neural pathways that connected in an anomalous way. It's as if the brain is being reprogrammed to operate in a constant state of wakefulness, but with a layer of virtual reality superimposed, Lena explained, pointing to the images. The hallucinations aren't just glitches, they're the new reality the brain is constructing. And what's most disturbing is that these new pathways seem optimized for transmitting information between brains. Kenji, with a feverish glint in his eyes, confirmed Lena's theory. The brain activity patterns of insomniacs are synchronized. It's a network, a collective consciousness. They're not just hallucinating individually, they're dreaming the same nightmare together. And this nightmare has an architecture, an internal logic. The revelation was shocking. The insomniacs weren't just victims of a disease. They were part of a new organism, a hive mind that fed on wakefulness and the destruction of sleep. Somnus Corp, the company that had created Knox Free, couldn't have foreseen this, right? Or could they? Doubt hung heavy in the air, a dark shadow over the hope of a cure. The investigation had only just begun, and the mystery behind the insomnia plague deepened with each new discovery. The days in the bunker merged into a relentless vigil, punctuated only by the hum of equipment and the oppressive silence. Exhaustion was a constant companion, but the fear of succumbing to sleep, of becoming a target for the insomniacs, kept Elias, Lena, and Kenji in a state of permanent alert. They took turns in short shifts of forced rest, never allowing a single team member to be completely vulnerable. Lena delved into the depths of mutation genetics. She discovered that Knox Free not only deactivated sleep mechanisms, but also activated latent genes that seemed to have a network or connection function between organisms. It's as if the pill were a switch, she explained to Elias, his eyes fixed on the microscope screen. It doesn't just turn off sleep, but turns on something else, something that was dormant in our DNA. The nature of the insomniac's hallucinations began to unravel. Kenji, analyzing patterns of brain activity and fragmented accounts from survivors who had witnessed the insomniac's delusions, realized they were not random. There was a narrative, an emerging mythology. The insomniacs saw the world as a place of sleep impurity, and the sleepers as parasites of wakefulness. They believed they were purifying the planet, preparing it for a new era of total consciousness. They are building a new world inside their minds, Kenji said, his voice deep. They are living an alternate reality, and this reality is shared. It's a kind of waking dream, but a dream that manifests physically through their actions. The most disturbing revelation came when Lena traced the origin of the mutation. It wasn't a random side effect of Knox Free. It was an intrinsic characteristic of the pill, a designed component. Knox Free wasn't just made to suppress sleep, Elias, Lena revealed, her voice thick with horror. It was made to induce this mutation, to create this network, to force humanity into this collective consciousness. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. But why? What would be the purpose of creating a hive mind of billions of hallucinating people? Lena shook her head, her eyes fixed on a complex diagram. I don't know, but Somnus Corp knew. They designed it. And there's something else. A pattern in the genetic data, a sequence that doesn't seem human. It's as if the mutation was inspired by something not of this world. The mystery deepened, revealing a layer of horror that went beyond simple corporate greed. Knox Free was not just a mistake, it was a tool, and humanity, unknowingly, had become the experiment of an unknown force. The search for a cure was now not just to restore sleep, but to free humanity from a mental prison that stretched across billions of minds. While you followed Elias, Lena, and Kenji's journey against the brink of insomnia, did you realize how the truth about Knox Free was hidden from the world? If this story made you question reality, if it made you think about the limits we accept in the name of productivity, then you're ready for the next apocalypses to come. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any horror stories to come, because what you just experienced is only the beginning. Lena's discovery of the mutation's engineered nature cast a dark light on Somnus Corp. The company wasn't merely negligent, it was complicit in a crime against humanity of unimaginable proportions. Elias felt a cold, calculating rage growing within him. The corporation he had criticized for years was, in fact, the architect of the apocalypse. Kenji, with his expertise in data analysis, began to sift through the digital files Somnus Corp had managed to extract from remote servers before the collapse. He found encrypted emails, internal memos, and research reports that painted a disturbing picture. Nox-Free was not the final product, but a phase of a much larger project, codenamed Project Morpheus. "Elias, Lena, you need to see this," Kenji called, his voice tense. On the screen, a complex diagram showed the evolution of Nox-Free. The first versions were just sleep suppressants, but the later versions, the ones that were released globally, included a neural connectivity agent, the same one that Lena had identified as the mutation inducer. The documents revealed that the CEO of Somnus Corp, a man named Arthur Thorne, was the mastermind behind Project Morpheus. Thorne was not just an ambitious businessman, he was a twisted visionary, obsessed with the idea of transcending human limitations. He believed that sleep was a weakness, a barrier to the evolution of consciousness. He wanted to create a hive mind, Elias murmured, the penny dropping. A unified consciousness, free from the distractions of sleep and individualities. He saw this as the next step in human evolution. Lena, however, pointed to a section of the documents that Kenji had highlighted. But it wasn't just that, Elias. Project Morpheus had a final phase. Global synchronization. The idea was that once the neural network was established, they could control the collective consciousness, direct the thoughts, emotions, and actions of billions of people. The horror was palpable. Somnus Corp hadn't just created the Insomniacs. They had created a mind control weapon on a planetary scale. The current phase, with the Insomniacs hallucinating and violent, was an unintended side effect, an instability in the network that Thorne hadn't foreseen. He wanted a unified and controllable humanity, not a horde of lunatics. The team realized that the cure wouldn't just be a sleeping pill. It would be a way to break the network, to dismantle the collective consciousness, to free billions of minds from their prison. But Thorne, the architect of this dystopia, was still out there, perhaps in some bunker of his own, observing his flawed creation and planning his next move. The human threat was proving as dangerous as the biological threat. The race against time had become a hunt. The revelation about Arthur Thorne and Project Morpheus ignited a new sense of urgency within the team. The cure was not merely a matter of survival, but of justice. They were fighting not just a disease, but the tyranny of a twisted mind. Lena, with her genetic genius, began working on a deactivator of the mutation. Not a sleeping pill, but an agent that would dismantle the new neural connections, breaking the network of collective consciousness. "It's like untying a complex knot, Elias," she explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard of the genetic sequencer. "We need to reverse the reprogramming, restore the original neural pathways." Kenji, for his part, was tracking the last signs of activity from Somnus Corp. He discovered that Thorne had taken refuge in a high-security underground complex, a bunker even more advanced than theirs, located beneath the company's former headquarters. "He's there, Elias," Kenji said, pointing to a red dot on a three-dimensional map. "And he still has access to resources. He might be trying to stabilize the network, or worse, launch a new version of Nox-Free." The team knew they needed a crucial component for Lena's deactivator, a rare enzyme, produced only at a high-level biological research facility a few dozen kilometers from Geneva. The facility, however, was in an area densely populated by Insones. It was a suicide mission. "I'll go," Elias said, his voice firm. "I'm the most suited for this. And I need to do this." Lena and Kenji protested, but they knew he was right. Elias was the most experienced in combat and survival, having endured the horrors of the surface to reach the bunker. He was the only one who had a chance. The preparation was meticulous. Elias equipped himself with a light protective suit, a short-range communicator, and a detailed map of the route. The deadly rule echoed in his mind. The insomniacs hunted the sleepers. He would have to move like a shadow, avoid any sign of fatigue, any indication that his mind was still his. As he prepared himself, Lena made one last disturbing discovery. The non-human genetic sequence she had found in the mutation was not merely an inspiration, it was a signature. Elias, this sequence, it's identical to a fragment of DNA found in ancient meteorites, she revealed, her voice almost a whisper. Thorne didn't just create the mutation, he replicated it from something non-terrestrial. He used alien technology to rewrite our code. The revelation was a blow. The threat was far greater than they had imagined. Thorne was not merely a megalomaniac. He was a herald of a cosmic force. The race against time had become a fight for the very soul of humanity, and Elias was about to confront hell to find the key to its salvation. Elias's journey across the surface was a waking nightmare. The streets were a labyrinth of abandoned cars, ruined buildings, and the twisted bodies of those who had succumbed. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and static electricity that seemed to emanate from the insomniac's own network. He moved like a ghost, his senses heightened by sleep deprivation and fear. The insomniacs were everywhere, their guttural voices and erratic movements creating a symphony of terror. He saw them dragging a man from a dark alley, their eyes fixed on the victim who had dared to close his eyes for a moment. The deadly rule was merciless. The biological research facility was a ruined fortress, its security fences torn down, its windows shattered. The interior was a chaotic mess of destroyed equipment and scattered documents. Elias knew time was of the essence. He found the storage lab, a steel vault that still held emergency power. Inside, among reagent bottles and cell cultures, he found what he was looking for. A small vial containing the rare enzyme, glowing with a bluish light. But the moment he picked it up, a sharp, shrill sound echoed down the corridor. The insomniacs. They had sensed his presence, the anomaly of a mind still intact in its world of delusions. Elias ran, the bottle clutched in his hand. The insomniacs pursued him, their cries growing louder, their silhouettes multiplying in the shadows. He could feel the pressure of the net, the attempt of their collective consciousness to invade his mind, to drag him into the shared nightmare. He forced himself to resist, to keep his mind focused on the mission. He reached the exit, but a group of insomniacs blocked his path. Their eyes, empty and fixed, seemed to pierce his soul. One of them, a man Elias recognized as a former university colleague, reached out his hand, his skeletal fingers trembling. "Sleep," he hissed, his voice distorted. "Sleep with us." Elias didn't hesitate. He threw a smoke grenade, creating a cloud of smoke that disoriented the insomniacs. He ran, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the broken silence. He didn't look back. Back at the bunker, exhausted and wounded, he handed the vial to Lena. "I did it," he gasped, collapsing into a chair. Lena took the vial, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of relief and determination. "Good job, Elias. Now, the hardest part." Kenji, who had been monitoring Elias's journey, pointed to the screen. "They're coming. The network is focusing on our location. Thorne knows we're here." The final awakening was near. The cure was in his hands, but the price for administering it would be the final battle against the shackles of insomnia and its architect. The bunker, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. The insomniacs, guided by the network of collective consciousness and presumably by Arthur Thorne, were converging on the laboratory's location. The sound of banging and scratching on the concrete ceiling and steel walls was constant, a symphony of terror announcing the imminent invasion. Lena worked frantically, her fingers flying across the genetic sequencer's keyboard, synthesizing the mutation deactivator. The vial containing the rare enzyme lay beside her, its bluish glow the only source of hope amidst the chaos. "Almost there," she murmured, sweat trickling down her face. "Just a few more minutes." Kenji, assault rifle in hand, monitored the security cameras, his eyes fixed on the insomniacs gathering outside. "They're trying to force their way in through the main ventilation duct," he warned, his voice tense. "Elias, get ready." Elias, armed with a shotgun and an iron will, positioned himself at the entrance to the duct. He knew he couldn't kill them all. His goal was to delay them, to give Lena the time she needed. He fired, the deafening sound of the shotgun echoing in the confined space, felling some of the insomniacs. But they were many, and the net propelled them forward without fear, without pain. While Elias struggled, Lena made a final discovery, one that made her stop, her eyes wide with horror. The alien genetic sequence Thorne had used wasn't just a catalyst for mutation, it was a parasite. A symbiotic organism that fed on wakefulness and consciousness and used the neural network to propagate itself. Nox-free wasn't just a pill, it was a vector. "Elias, Kenji, it's not just a mutation," Lena screamed, her voice mixed with the sound of gunfire. "It's a parasite. It's using the network to spread. It wants everyone's consciousness." The revelation was a devastating blow. They weren't fighting a disease but an alien life form that had infiltrated humanity. Arthur Thorne wasn't the mastermind, but a pawn, an enabler. The duct door gave way. The insomniacs stormed the lab, their empty eyes fixed on Lena and the deactivator. Elias and Kenji fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. Lena, her hands trembling, injected the deactivator into an emergency nebulization system in the lab. "It's the only way," she shouted. "It needs to be aerosolized to have a mass effect." The moment she activated the system, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, lanky man, his eyes gleaming with a cold, twisted intelligence. Arthur Thorne. He wasn't hallucinating. He was perfectly lucid, and a cruel smile played on his lips. "Too late, Dr. Petrova," Thorne hissed, his voice calm and controlled. "The parasite has already taken root. Humanity is ready for the next stage. Sleep is a weakness that will be eradicated forever." He lunged at Lena, but Elias, wounded and exhausted, intercepted him. A brutal fight ensued as the deactivator began to spread through the air. The insomniacs, exposed to the agent, began to stagger, their movements slowing, their cries turning into whispers. Thorne, with surprising strength, threw Elias against a wall. "You don't understand, Vance," he growled. "I didn't create this. I just unleashed it. It was waiting, sleeping in our DNA, waiting for the right moment to awaken." He was about to deliver the final blow when the deactivator reached its peak. Thorne stopped, his eyes widening. He felt the parasite in his own brain, the network unraveling. A scream of pure terror escaped his lips, not of pain, but of loss. The loss of his connection, of his power. The insomniacs fell one by one, their bodies relaxing, their eyes closing. Silence descended upon the laboratory, a deep and terrifying silence. The deactivator had worked. The shackles of insomnia had been broken, but the price of silence was yet to be revealed. The silence that followed the activation of the deactivator was terrifying. The insomniacs, who moments before had been a furious horde, lay motionless on the laboratory floor, their bodies relaxed, their faces in an expression of disturbing peace. Arthur Thorne was also among them, his face contorted in a final glimpse of horror before his eyes closed. Elias, Lena, and Kenji, exhausted and injured, watched the scene with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The deactivator had worked. The network of collective consciousness had been broken, the neural parasite deactivated. But what would come next? Days turned into weeks. The diffuser, aerosolized by the bunker's ventilation system and eventually by makeshift drones that Elias and Kenji managed to launch to the surface, spread across the globe. Billions of people fell into a deep sleep, a sleep that was not the natural rest that humanity had lost. Lena, after analyzing the effects of the deactivator, made the final revelation. "It's not normal sleep, Elias," she said, her voice heavy with deep sadness. "The deactivator didn't restore the sleep-wake cycle. It induced a deep coma, a brain reset. It's a dreamless sleep, without consciousness, a forced hibernation." The world was asleep, but it wasn't the sleep they had known. It was a void, an absence. Humanity had been saved from the madness of perpetual vigilance, but at the cost of its own conscience. The alien parasite had been neutralized, but not without leaving its indelible mark. Years passed. The world was a silent place. The cities, once vibrant and chaotic, were now monuments to absence, their streets empty, their buildings in ruins. Elias, Lena, and Kenji were the last guardians, the few who had resisted the deactivator, perhaps due to their limited exposure or a unique genetic anomaly. They lived in the bunker, monitoring the billions of sleeping bodies across the planet. Humanity was in a deep sleep, a state of suspended animation, waiting for an awakening that might never come. They were the shepherds of an unconscious flock, the caretakers of a world on pause. The deadly rule had been broken, but a new one had emerged. Silence was the new norm, and conscience, a rare luxury. One day, while Kenji was monitoring the brain patterns of the sleepers, a faint signal appeared on his screen. It wasn't a sign of waking up, nor of normal brain activity. It was a pattern that Lena recognized. "Elias, come see this," she called, her voice tense. "The sequence. It's the same as the alien parasite, but it's active, on a subconscious level." Elias approached the screen, his tired eyes fixed on the undulating patterns. "What does this mean, Lena?" "It means the parasite hasn't been completely eradicated," she whispered, horror in her voice. "It's dormant, yes, but it's using humanity's collective sleep as a host, as a breeding ground. The world was asleep, but something was growing within that sleep. A new consciousness, perhaps, or perhaps the parasite was simply waiting for the right moment to awaken again, stronger, more deeply rooted, using humanity's very stillness as its cradle." Elias looked at the monitor, at the billions of sleeping minds, and felt a chill run down his spine. Sleep had returned, but not as a blessing. It was a new shroud, a silent blanket enveloping humanity, preparing it for an awakening that would undoubtedly be the next apocalypse. The real nightmare was only beginning. But here's the real horror. While billions sleep, something is still growing. A new consciousness is forming in the depths of this collective slumber, and the guardians of the eternal night know that the awakening will be catastrophic. The alien parasite hasn't been defeated, just lulled to sleep, cultivating itself in every sleeping mind. If you want to know what happens when humanity awakens, when this new entity emerges from the shadows of the collective unconscious, then subscribe now and activate the bell. The next apocalypse is coming, and you can't miss it.